Mithila was obviously the starting point, as I mentioned, and Acharya Gangesh Upadhyay was the pioneer of sorts. Acharya Bhattacharya, Acharya Taralamkara, Acharya Raghunath Shiromani, these are the three biggest lights, so to say, of the Navya Nyāya tradition who came from Bengal, and I think their contributions still continue to kind of guide the path. Nowadays we talk about Oxford and Cambridge, right? It was kind of the Oxford of Indian logic at one point. Bengal, and in particular this center called Nabadvip. Bengal also had something known as the Tols, right? The Tols or the Chatushpati, which is basically that the Tols were smaller decentralized centers of learning. I would say instead of being just reactive, the reason we should definitely talk about Navya Nyāya is because what is the way forward, right? What is the future of Bengal? We often debate and discuss about this, right? But to understand where should we talk about the future of Bengal, we need to understand what were the pillars of Bengal in the first place, right? What was it that created the Bengal we know as it stands?
Namaste. Welcome to another sit-down session with Sangam Talks, and we are grateful to have Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar among us today, and thank you, sir, for taking out your time again with us. He is the adjunct professor of National Institute of Advanced Studies from Bengaluru. He is now an assistant professor of Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, Delhi NCR. He is a scholar of advanced physics, quantum mechanics, and one of the niche books on Indian metaphysics. He has written one book which is critically acclaimed, that is From Shiva to Schrodinger. We will take it brief because we are going to talk about a very interesting topic today, which is Navya Nyāya. And it's a vast topic. So Navya Nyāya, and not only Navya Nyāya, the Bengali Tarka Shastra, how it contributed to the Navya Nyāya. I will ask Dr. Mrittunjoy to start with what exactly is Navya Nyāya, what the definition of it.
Right. Thank you, Debashish. Navya Nyāya is a rather important revolutionary step that was seen in the journey that we know as Nyaya. Nyaya being what is sometimes very simplistically mentioned as logic, right? But the Nyaya Parampara, right, when we talk about Nyaya Vaisheshik, is part of a darshanik perspective, which looks at different aspects of nature. In Vaisheshik, obviously, we have this concept of padartha, categories of different things that we see around us. Nyaya has been more towards the logical aspects of how you formulate it, how you understand nature, how you understand reality itself. And Navya Nyāya, or as literally it would be new logic, basically, if you were to make it a very simplistic transliteration, is much beyond that, right? It is a 13th century kind of revolution that happened in the Nyaya Parampara, and it interestingly came from the eastern part of the country, of our country. Initially it was from Mithila, where we had Gangesh Upadhyay, Acharya Gangesh Upadhyay ji. His work Tattva Chintamani and various works thereof was the starting point of that. Later on, that came towards Bengal, and there were few proponents, few very eminent luminaries who worked in that area. Raghunath Shiromani ji and various others have worked in this domain, and the idea behind all of this revolution that we are talking about, is to how to make it more fine-tuned, this idea of logic, the idea of reasoning, essentially. And it is interesting because oftentimes we look at a lot of these darshanik perspectives and a lot of the Indian knowledge systems in terms of going beyond logic or trans logic, as we call it, right? But there is a way that we can approach the fundamental reality of the universe in terms of logical structures as well, in terms of how we articulate the whole idea or the existence of these things that we see around us. So for instance, Brahmanda, right, or Ishvara, right, these are aspects or these are elements, right, which have to be spoken of in terms of very logical aspects that we see around us, for that matter. And how do we take it forward, right? And how do we take it forward not only in terms of isolation, in isolation, but in terms of dialogues as well, right? So if Nyaya was the way to kind of understand this in some form, Navya Nyaya brought it brought an even greater minuteness to it, a greater definite articulation of it, right? So if Nyaya was the foundation, if you will, Navya Nyaya gave it a greater structure above it, a greater architecture of reasoning and logic above that. And so one can say that it gave it a crystalline structure, if you will, to use a scientific terminology, and even the simplest and subtlest of distinctions between what is cognition, what is knowledge, and how do you analyze, different elements out there in nature with a certain degree of precision, right, and a certain degree of nuance. This is what Navya Nyaya brought forth. And I am very proud to be a Bengali, to be an Eastern Indian in that sense, and Bharatiya, of course, any day, because I think we often forget or don't even know about this very rich tradition that comes from those parts of Bharat. And we often forget that when we talk about Western rationalism, Western, logical reasoning, the scientific discourse, as it will, we did have a very rich tradition before that, right? Before the colonial exercise started, way before that, actually. And we often forget those parts, so to say, right? So therefore, we must contextualize the discussion in terms of understanding that when we say an argumentative Bengali, right? We often say that, Bengalis are very good at argumentation, right? And sometimes people criticize that not for the right reasons necessarily. But I would like to highlight that a lot of it comes from this rich tradition of Tarka Shastra and Navya Nyaya itself. And this was often placed in the context of dharma, in the context of cohesion and order, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that is
very important, right? Because we often say that argument for the sake of argument, right, is not what we require or we need. And in the Bharatiya Parampara, we never have had that. There are different categories for that as well, right? When you do a fallacious argument, when you say something just for the sake of, rebutting somebody, right? But that is just one small part of the much larger domain, essentially.
Western ideas leaking.
Right. So, I think we need to reclaim that space, and we need to understand that the argumentative Bengali or the argumentative Indian comes from a much more dharmic space, right? And a much more rigorous history and tradition of the Nyaya Parampara in that sense.
So Nyaya is the predecessor, and current understanding is the Bengali Tarka Shastra.
Right.
Maybe the
Right, yes.
come after Navya Nyaya.
Yeah.
But don't you think, if I say, am I be right that it's Bengal act as a central theme,
center point of sorts.
center point, maybe I can say that,
right,
if I may. So center point of, so Tarka Shastra is actually contributing to the Navya Nyaya.
Absolutely. So I think when we say that Mithila was obviously the starting point, as I mentioned, and Acharya Gangesh Upadhyay was the pioneer of sorts in this domain. But when we talk about Acharya Raghunath, Shiromani, right, when we talk about various others as well, we see that you can almost, if you were, nowadays we talk about Oxford and Cambridge, right? It was kind of the Oxford of Indian logic at one point. Bengal, and in particular this center called Nabodip, right? We all know about Nabodip. So Nabodip was the point where many of these articulations, many of these pioneering works were taking place. An interesting part here is that Bengal also had something known as the Tols, right? The Tols or the Chatushpati, which is basically that the Tols were smaller decentralized centers of learning. And in this we had different areas of, logic, we had different areas of Tarka Shastra, and not only that, astronomy, different avenues of the Indian knowledge system, so to say. And we oftentimes forget that Bengal was a thriving hotbed of intellectual, generation and creativity, essentially, right? It was not just a stagnant kind of recipient of the colonial exercise, so to say. And somewhere that was lost, or it was kind of, I would say, distorted possibly, because when we talk about the communist regime, when we talk about the current regimes as well, it is not kind of contextualized in the historical way, and it is very shallow in its perspective in that sense, right? And that is very, very unfortunate, because you read about times when young scholars used to have these dialectical debates, right? These almost combats of sorts, Purva Paksha and various aspects thereof. Then you had, even in open courtyards, mane ekta bot gacher niche, right? When you talk about the banyan tree and sitting under that, which is the model which I think Rabindranath Tagore took when we went to Shantiniketan, right? He donated all his money from the Nobel Prize to that. I think that was not an act in isolation again, right? It was something which brought forth a longer tradition in that sense.
We must realize that may be an attempt to revitalize the toll tradition.
Absolutely.
Maybe the Bengali community all maybe aware of that term toll.
Right.
We had that idea that tolls are the monopolization of some Brahmin communities.
Yes.
And there are some native, hodgepodge ideas propagating from there. Not like just only grammar and Sanskrit.
It almost seems like there's a toll to the knowledge, essentially, like in the toll kind of plaza kind of a thing in modern context. But it's much more than that, because if you look at even Rabindranath Tagore's works, right, and his poetry, his ideations, there is a lot of connection to the ground, right? There's a lot of kind of earthen kind of aspect to it, right? When we talk about Baul Shongit, right? When we talk about the spiritual traditions thereof, I think there is so much to understand and learn from that, right? Even a simple Baul Shongit, if you look at the lyrics, right? There is so much of it that evades even the best of poets and intellectuals today, many a times. So this whole idea that the Tols were very isolated, elite ivory tower of sorts, absolutely goes against the whole definition of a toll, firstly. And then we often forget that many of these universities, right, not only in terms of the Navya Nyāya scholars, but when you talk about Nalanda, when you talk about Vikramshila, Odantapuri, there was so much going on at that time, right? I mean, we all know that Nalanda's library burned for 3 months, right, without, any discontinuation. So that there was that much of material for it to have burned that way. And then in other monastic universities, we had a rich tradition that came forth. But once the resistance of the Sen dynasty, right, we say that Lakshman Sen, I think in one of our discussions we had discussed this in the past, that Lakshman Sen put up a resistance for 50 odd years. People often forget that although he did flee from his capital, right, initially, when Bakhtiyar Khilji came in from Bihar side, but then he did put up a resistance afterwards and kept that going for some time. So when we talk about that, we forget that the manuscripts that came, many of the manuscripts from Nalanda, were actually brought towards Bengal first, and then they were sent northwards, right, towards the east and the other parts of the oriental side. So we have to understand that it has to be extremely it'll be a disservice almost if we do not again place the exact manner in which these things were oriented in history, right? So when we say that, again, the whole idea of intellectualism, right? We say that it came from the Bhadralok tradition. It came from the Britishers having placed their education centers and their political centers in Bengal, right? I mean, Kolkata was the capital of India for the longest time, in British India, I mean. That is doing complete disservice to all of this that went on before that, right? So when we talk about Lakhon Sen, when we talk about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when we talk about the Navya Nyāya tradition, when we talk about the ways in which the Anandamot revolution and the whole spirit of the nationalistic side came forth, when we talk about the Anushilan Samiti, and thereafter when we talk about various pioneers who came after that, there is only a small puddle in this whole river of attainments from the Bengali side that we usually kind of focus on, and we forget all the rest of it usually. Right, so and that I think is a great disservice to the Bengali identity in that sense.
When we give attention and dig deep into the colonization period, I mean it's all boiled down to one thing, like knowledge system,
right?
And the toll tradition is like just an inclusive thing,
right?
Attempt for the protection against the colonization,
right?
In such
absolutely. And so I think when we mention about us coming into Vikasit Bharat, right? I mean, Narendra Modi ji talks about Vikasit Bharat and Atmanirbharta. I think, in one of the recent movies in the Bengal files, there is this dialogue which says that Bengal was a lighthouse of India, right? And I mean, so was Kashmir in its own way. I mean, I have mentioned about that in my book, where Trika Shaiva Darshan, Natya Shastra, Yoga Vashishta, all of these have had some connections to Kashmir. And even the poets, the scholars of back in the day, medieval times, many of them had connections to Kashmir. Now, we forget that many of them also had a connection to Bengal, right? I mean, and not only that, when I often hear that people say that Bengalis were never martial in their own ways, they never put up resistances per se, but people forget conveniently that Prithviraj Chauhan, I mean, there are some texts that say that one of his generals, Udayraj Gowda, from the Gowda province, which is Bengal, was very much a general of his, right? And he was a prominent general, so much so that he attacked Delhi even after there was the whole the Battle of Tarain happened, and he tried to kind of salvage the situation in a certain way. And then there was the Malla kingdom, Malla dynasties. There were various others who had a lot of role to play across this medieval period. So both in terms of intellectualism and in terms of this resistance, right? I think Bengal has done a lot, right? But having said that, I would say instead of being just reactive, the reason we should definitely talk about Navya Nyāya is because what is the way forward, right? What is the future of Bengal? We often debate and discuss about this, right? But to understand where should we talk about the future of Bengal, we need to understand what were the pillars of Bengal in the first place, right? What was it that created the Bengal we know as it stands?
So
right?
talking about pillars, Dr. Mrittunjoy, we were talking about that there are some luminaries,
right?
From 13th to 17th century, the Tarka Shastra evolved. So please tell us something about those.
So the first name that comes to mind, of course, is Acharya Raghunath Shiromani's, and Tattva Chintamani was given by Acharya Gangesh Upadhyay, and there was a commentary on that which was called Didithi, and Tattva Chintamani Didithi, which is by Raghunath Shiromani, and in that there were a lot of aspects of existence, for instance, and the concept of abhava, which is basically this concept that if you were to have an absence of something, right? Suppose something is not there in front of us, right? Can it be talked about in terms of a presence rather, right? Or a what you call a vacuous presence, or a positive way to define it in certain ways, right? That is something which he talks about quite a bit. And then he also goes on to speak about the relational theory of cognition, right? How cognition happens and what is the relative aspects of cognition. He speaks about the subject, object, and the knowledge. Basically, when in modern scientific terms we talk about semiosis, there is this term called semiosis. Semiosis means meaning formation, right? So there is something which is a subject, and then there's the object and the act thereof, right? Or the interpretation of what is being observed. Things on those lines, and I would say a fairly strong tradition along those lines was already being given by Acharya Raghunath Shiromani in his Diditi and other works as well. Then we have Acharya Jagadish Taralamkara, right, who was a little later he came forth, and he talked about the connections between metaphysics and language, right? For instance, he talks about this idea of Savikalpa and Nirvikalpa, right? So if you had something where there is a pre-conceptual awareness, right? And there is something where you have something like a categorical perception, like there is a category and you are perceiving that, right? So the former is called as Nirvikalpa and the other is called as Savikalpa. So the differentiation of that, the distinction between that was given by him in a big way, right? And then there is also this aspect that meaning does not come from directly pointing something out, right? Meaning also comes from various kinds of what he regards as ontological structures, right? Structures of existences, so to say, because ontology is that, right? And ontology is the fundamental nature of existence itself. So if you were to talk about ontological structures and how they internally, right, and by themselves give meaning or purpose or a definition of existence itself, those were aspects that Acharya gave to us as well, right? And so this is important because we say that language can only approximate, right? If I talk about a flower, right, I'm talking about certain symptoms of, or rather properties of the flower, right? I'm not actually defining what the flower is per se, right? Because that is often beyond the possibility of language or the definition thereof. So when Acharya Taralamkar talks about it, he does highlight this aspect as well, right? And he also talks about universals, this idea of universals, universal properties or structures thereof. Then finally we have Acharya Gadadhara Bhattacharya. He basically looks more at the aspect of language itself, right? Not connecting it necessarily all that much to external metaphysics, but the what we call as linguistic metaphysics in that sense. And he has various texts like Shaktivada, for instance, and there he talks about these analytical ways to approach, language formation and the elements of language, so to say. And so there is one question he gives which is very interesting. He says, can we refer to non-existent items meaningfully? Is there a way that we can talk about that meaningfully in that sense? And he talks about how sense and reference can be used to define things that are not existent at any point in time, right? He says, is there a way that we can refer to something, right, when that is not evidently there per se, right? So these are aspects which make the impossible even analyzable, so to say, right? So Acharya Bhattacharya, Acharya Taralamkara, Acharya Raghunath Shiromani, these are the three biggest lights, so to say, of the Navya Nyāya tradition who came from Bengal. And I think their contributions still continue to kind of guide the path, so to say, when we talk about logic, when we talk about reasoning, when we talk about how do you regard existence, non-existence, conditional referencing, relative theories that we talk about. So when Buddhism talks about relativity, right, relative existence, here also we see another form of relative existence, so to say. So all of these are very important parts of that. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, these, can I say that they are innovative technicalities that exclusively came, contributed to Navya Nyāya from Bengal?
Yes, so I think it will be a little incorrect to attribute Navya Nyāya per se or the pillars thereof only to Bengal, right? Because to be fair, it did have a lot of, Mithila had a lot of role to play thereof. But the qualification of Navya Nyāya, the expansion, the elaboration, you could also say some of the loopholes that existed even within Tattva Chintamani for that matter, was commented upon in the Diditi for that matter, right? And it was taken forward in a major way, so to say, right? So for instance, we often say that like in the West, right? When you talk about the British universities, right? There's also this ongoing debate that Manchester University happens to have a lot of things which was eventually attributed to work within Cambridge at times, right? In terms of science, so to say. And also before that, there were many other centers like Canterbury and various others in England, which did maybe more than Cambridge Oxford did. But Cambridge Oxford is known for taking it to its logical conclusion, taking it to a certain stature, right? Which it is at the moment, right? So Bengal in a big way did that, so to say. And when we talk about the aspects of how Raghunath Shiromani ji refined things, there were many gaps in the Tattva Chintamani, for instance, that people talk about, things that he thought was important to observe and comment upon, right? And so, for instance, existence. So a question that comes to mind is existence a property or is it a category? Right? Is it something which is a category of nature, or is it just a aspect? Is it just a property of nature per se? Right? So Raghunath Shiromani ji and various others of the Navya Nyāya school of thought talked about the dharam, or you can talk about the property aspect of things of existence itself. Right? So that was a very interesting kind of qualification of the very basis of anything we talk about, basically nature of reality, as we say, right? So that is a very, very important and powerful part of things. Now, there were others also, like for instance, when we talk about Acharya Jagadish, right? He had a lot of this, so he had a text called Tarkamrita, right? Tarkamrita, and there he talks about this complex machinery he tries to develop, right? He talks about clarifying the technical apparatus, which Acharya Gangesh talks about in his Tattva Chintamani. Then there is the aspect of Acharya Gadadhara and how he speaks about this point on semantics. Semantics is basically meaning formation, right? How does meaning come forth from various articulations? And he also again looks at non-existent entities, and he looks at how to extend the analytical tools in novel directions, in newer directions, so to say. And then there is one last tradition which people often talk about or don't talk about, which is that of the Krodapatra traditions, right? Where basically the idea was that even very minute logical problems are looked at with a lot of depth, right? They're kind of rigorously, it'll be very small element, maybe in one logical kind of sequence, let's say, or a technique, so to say, and they will just kind of focus on that, right, and try to kind of articulate it in the last to the last mile, so to say, right? So the Krodapatra tradition showed that Bengal was more interested in intensive analytical engagement, right? We were not happy with just, in we say satahi level, right? Superficial level pay, surface level pay. If we do things, that's not enough, right? And somewhere maybe that itself is what, again, today, whenever you say anything out there in terms of policy, in terms of philosophy, we often see that Bengalis are very, very, sharp in terms of the way we are incisive in what we are commenting or observing. So in some ways that does come from this tradition, which laid emphasis on this part as well, right? But again, as you said, it has been distorted, and a very negative side of it has been brought out, right? Whereas originally it was much more dharmic in its own way, in that sense. Yeah.
So whether we agree or disagree that Bengal may be the lighthouse
Right.
of the knowledge system
Yeah,
India
yeah.
has, but we have that understanding that it started all from the colonization era, from the British
Right,
period.
right.
But don't you think that time period
Yeah.
when the revolution happened
Yeah.
on knowledge, on Tarka Shastra,
Yeah.
isn't that contributed for the Renaissance we think to know about in the 19th century?
Absolutely. In
after
fact,
colonization?
in the 19th century, it's very interesting that William Ward, he had a survey in 1820, roughly in the 1820s, and he found that actually the toll system of Bengal, there were a number of tolls that existed. So there were about, I think, as per the 1820 survey, in Nadia district, there were about 17 of them, which were exclusively for Nyaya traditions, right? And they had around 434 students, roughly, which is a sizable number in that sense. And there were many of them where the students varied from 5 to 125, right? One school having 125 kids in that era, where people were talking about in the West afterwards, they said that we didn't have any institutions of knowledge or academics beyond a point, right? The whole idea of Macaulay's, of the various others who came after that, was to show us as, I'm sorry to say, but almost like primates from the jungle, right? Whereas we were much more sophisticated, right? And the funny part is, Navya Nyāya is new extensions of Nyaya, but Nyaya tradition itself is very old, right? So even when sorry to put it in that way, but when the Druids were around in England, right, at that time maybe our people were actually talking about Nyaya in certain ways, right? So I mean the comparison is so absurd in its own way, right? So anyway, so the point is that students from everywhere, from I have the survey records for your reference and for the viewers' knowledge, that people everywhere from Dhaka to Rangpur to Dinajpur, Pabna, Rajshahi, Jessore, Midnapur, even Mithila, Delhi, Puri and Madras used to come to these centers of education, right? There was everything from grammar, astronomy, poetry, rhetoric, lexicons, lexical kind of aspects, philosophy, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali and Bengali, of course. And the training was very rigorous, right? So if you had to be a scholar in Smriti, for instance, you had to almost spend around 8 years, right? In Nyaya tradition, almost 10 years before you got, the final kind of grade, so to say, in modern parlance. And obviously it was a Guru Shishya Parampara, which was there. And there would also be often various debates that used to happen among the scholars. And when the education had got completed, there was this title system, right? So people would be called, for instance, Bhushana, Alankara and Bhushana, right? These are suffixes of sorts. And then there is aspect of Chudamani. Chudamani also, you may recall, we had talked about Viveka Chudamani, right? So Chudamani is basically the crest jewel, so to say, jewel, which we have. There were various other Shiromani, right? Ratna. Vachaspati, right? Vagish means that the Lord of words, so to say. And it is very interesting because you just now mentioned about this aspect of caste and how divisions were thought of, right? That things were more of with the Brahmins and not with the others. But even within that, there was a healthy practice that people coming from specific families actively opted for titles that distinguished them from the families, right? So this has been seen, and even in Ward and various other commentaries, it says that students went for those titles that distinguished them in their own merit, in their own right, so to say, right? So this whole idea of fossilization and ossification of structures, so to say, I think is tenuous at best if we were to go by this understanding. And then interestingly, the institutional support. Many of the kings and zamindars of that time, were patrons of this tradition, right? So you have, Krishna Chandra Roy, king of Nodia, Kirti Chand, Tilak Chand, kings of Bardhaman. Then you have Ramakanta, Bhavani, right, who were from Nator, Gopal Singh, who was Bishnupur's Malla king from the Malla dynasty. All of them were patrons of this, right? And it is so interesting that not only in the 19th
there
century.
is a famous Vachaspati from the Nadia.
Yes, absolutely, right. But the funny thing is, interesting thing is, this was not only in the 19th century, even in the 20th century, in 1918, for instance, the governor of Bengal says, and I quote, "The subtleties of the Nyaya system, which has been handed down through immemorial ages and is today the pride and glory of the Tols of Nabaddeep," right? Indicating that there was still a relevance of the toll system, of this whole idea, this whole Nyaya Parampara within Bengal up to the 20th century, well into the British period, right? So again, the whole idea which people say Bengal became what it was because the British made it so is absolutely not true, right? And it kind of completely decimates and disrespects all that came before it, essentially. Yeah.
So though Macaulinian system triumphed by destroying our toll system, toll tradition, and also, but still we retain those things into our DNA, I think, if I may.
Yes.
But figures like Raja Rammohn Roy also, in one way try to validate these titles, the holders of such titles like Vachaspati.
Yeah.
But in some way, we also retain that, and that's our legacy.
Right.
So what will be our future? How can we reconnect with that?
Yeah,
Navya?
yeah.
I will end with
Right,
question.
yeah. And so I think there is a lot of aspect of that. Essentially, one is, of course, within university spaces and within academic spaces, people are looking at Navya Nyaya very seriously. For instance, even in Bengal, even places which are otherwise, often seen to be not promoting Indian knowledge systems at times, there are divisions that look at it in certain ways. And I kind of remember in the West as well, the University of Toronto, for instance, there Professor Jonardhan Guneri, right? He's one of the most well-known philosophers. He holds the Bimal K. Matilal Distinguished Professorship, and he and others have looked at various aspects of this. In fact, Guneri's work, right, which is called The Lost Age of Reason, which was published in 2011, also talks about this aspect. And he says that Navya Nyaya actually represented a distinctive form of modernity, right, of the logical structures that predated modernity and actually reinforced what modernity anyway said, right? And so the innovations in semantics, the philosophy of languages, these are all mentioned in Guneri's work, right? Then there is this aspect of how do you look at the formal analysis of it, right? Because we often trivialize things saying that na oita to eto kichu koreni, right? They didn't do all that much either, right? But the idea is that Ganeri and others have tried to look at how to formally regimentation of the Navya Nyaya traditions and the characterization of it is something that he has looked at very closely. But there is still a lot of work to do on that front. Then today's age, we talk about AI, we talk about these different kinds of general ontology research that goes on when we talk about semantic webs, AI, and so on and so forth. So there are some people who are trying to look at whether there could be some connections between these aspects as well, because we know that Sanskrit itself is a very mantric language. It is something which has its very rigorous logic structures and the grammar rules as well. And even when we talk about Bengali, when we talk about the different other languages that were there in Bengal at the time and across the ages, actually, they have a lot to offer, so to say. So there is active work going on whether there are ways to define novel representation frameworks using the laws or the rules of Navya Nyāya as well as the languages that existed in that province and in India in general, for that matter, right? Now, there is also this point of comparative philosophy, right? How do you kind of look at how this compares with things that exist as it stands? Because I always say, and in previous videos also have said, that at the end of the day, policy, politics, society, somewhere we are not aimlessly going in various ways, right? We are not just randomly choosing whatever we are wanting to do. We have a certain way that we define the premise on which the foundation, so to say, right? And many a times what is happening today, which I see and observe, is that the Western ways of thinking and doing things are oftentimes restricted, right? They are oftentimes not actually helping us in many ways as well. So there is an importance of comparatively looking at philosophy that comes from the West and this Navya Nyāya tradition for that matter, and maybe synthesizing something novel from that, which is more meaningful, which is more dharmic, which is more aligned with the Bharatiya interests and the way of thinking as such, right? And lastly, I would say that the educational value, right? Because I see oftentimes that nowadays there is this thing called rebel without a cause, right? We say that, kuch bhi ho jaye, just, wokeism, for instance, right? I mean, there are dime a dozen things in which sometimes, unfortunately, we have aspects of this thing we see in day-to-day life, right? And sometimes it is problematic because not everything needs to be summarily rejected, right? Number one. Number two, there is nuance to everything. I mean, you have to deliberate, you have to understand, you have to kind of formulate things in a certain way where there is harmony, there is some degree of order in society. Otherwise there is no point to all of that, right? So I would say that that is a very, very important thing. But the most important thing in all of this, right, I see this, the whole idea of Navya Nyāya, the whole idea of Tarka Shastra, as a way to reclaim the intellectual and spiritual spirit, the soul, the heart of Bengal, right? Today we are, as Bengalis, right, and Prabashi Bangali at that, staying in Delhi though, what pains us so much is the plight of the Bengalis today and the Bengali Hindus as in particular, for that matter, because my family comes from Bangladesh, right? We in partition had to come over, and there was a lot of rich tradition, a lot of memories, right? Intergenerational memories that have either been lost or been misplaced in many ways. Even otherwise,
the darkest tragedy in human
the darkest tragedy, right? I mean, and people forget that Bengal was not just the Nawab, right? There were so many undercurrents, right? Even today, right? I mean, we have many people who are either silent or quietly working a way towards ensuring that Bengal remains Bengal in its spirit, in that way, because everything from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Vaishnavite movement, towards Navya Nyāya and various other streams thereof, I think points to the fact that there is a Bengal that we often forget, a Bengal we do not know about, and that is the Hindu, the Dharmic Bengal, which we really need to stand up for, right? Going forward, I think politics is on one hand is important, of course, but at the end of the day, civilisationally, how do we salvage and protect Bengal? We have to really closely think about that, right? And not only the government, some body, some organization, I am talking about each and every Bengali out there, right? And not only Bengal, even the Bharatiya people, right? We always say Anandamot, right? Inspired and triggered the freedom movement in many ways, right? Why can we not have Bengal being the fountainhead of the Bharat of tomorrow, of the Vikasit Bharat we want, right? Why are we always reactive? Why are we always, trying to justify and be apologetic about where we stand, right? Why don't we go forward and do things in the best way we can? And I really hope, and this is my prayer, right, that the Bengal of the past and the Bengal of the future is really the Bengal that is the lighthouse of all of Bharat.
That's great to hear, and
Right.
hopefully the Bengali community, and not only just Bengal, the assimilation of all the Indian philosophical thoughts, all are connected through all the Smriti Shastras,
Right.
and it goes beyond not only Bengal, not only India,
Right.
but globally, geopolitically
Absolutely.
also.
Absolutely.
We can.
Absolutely.
So, with that note, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
Mrittunjoy
Thank you so much.
Guha,
Yeah.
and we will end there. Thank you very much for joining us today.